Okay, learning objective 2 for Salutary Neglect. Discuss the background and the development of New Plymouth and how it represents the principles of salutary neglect. So as a consequence of this hostility, between 1608 and 1609, many of the Separatists fled to Holland, where they eked out a pretty hard living. After living in the Netherlands for some time, many of the Separatists feared that they were losing their distinct identity. As what's interesting is their children were losing contact with their native English culture, and they themselves were prevented from participating in the Dutch guild or union system. So there was no real place for them in the Netherlands, since they weren't Dutch. They were English, and their children were going to have a hard time there. So with these problems, plus also the fear that Spain, a Catholic country, might conquer the Netherlands, led some Separatists, among them William Bradford, this guy down here, later who would become the governor of the colony, to organize a movement to go to the New World, where they might have more of a favorable environment. Money presented a major obstacle, like anything, to their plans, so they petitioned for a land patent and a loan from the Virginia Company of London, which was already there. According to the terms of the contract that was drawn out, they would accompany a body of non-pilgrims on a voyage to some of the unclaimed lands of Virginia, and the company would also advance them 700 pounds. In return, the colonists would work 7 years, basically as indentured servants for the Virginia Company. And at the end of the time, all the profits derived from fishing and trading would be divided between the settlers and the merchants. On September 16th, 1620, this is a date we've all heard of before, the Mayflower sailed with 101 people for the New World. A baby was born on the way over, so 102 people arrived. They're supposed to go here, right, somewhere down here. They ended up landing right over here. Let me make this. So again, this was their destination in Virginia. They ended up moving up into this area here. They ended up here because they were set off course by a storm, and this is going to have significant consequences. So they're there, they arrive late. They're there November 11th, 1620. It's too late to plant any crops. And this area is clearly outside of the domain of the Virginia Company. And consequently, the settlers became squatters. They were without legal right to the land and without specific authority to establish a government. A serious matter, since some of the sailors were not pilgrims. They threatened to mutiny. Before disembarking, and in order to avoid anarchy, 41 of the settlers' men agreed to quote, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. And the Pilgrims' leaders drew up and signed the very famous Mayflower Compact, which has been evoked in history time and time again as an early form of cooperation and of early forms of democracy, which we'll go into later. It's also been used as a way of showing some of the ironies of history, as Malcolm X once did in the 1960s.
Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
So, consequently, a contract or a social compact voluntarily drawn up by settlers themselves became the foundation of government in early Plymouth. Every member had a right to vote for governor and his assistants, which meant that everyone had a voice in determining policy. Hence, the Mayflower Compact does stand with the Virginia Assembly of 1619 as the foundation and basic principles of self-government. and this is going to be later the foundations of salutary neglect, which we'll talk about the definition of it in just a little bit. The seeds of self-government in the House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact, the House of Burgesses being the legislative body in Virginia that we talked about in the last lecture, were the products of constitutional evolution within England, which dated back to the Magna Carta of 1215. So these transplanted ideas, or germ theory, as it's been known, were eventually to be modified and molded into institutions. In some cases, so distinctively as to embody eventually a distinct American character. The Compact was the foundation of the colony's government and served as such until 1686, when the king combined the colony with the rest of New England in a vast colony called the Dominion of New England, which we'll talk about later. Plymouth never received a charter from the king and was the only colony not to do so. However, the Council for New England, which had control over the area by way of the charter from the king, did grant a patent for title in the land in 1621, giving each settler 100 acres. The boundaries of the patent were not spelled out at this time, though, however. So herein lies the foundation of this concept of salutary neglect, of what this whole lecture is all about, the development of salutary neglect, its practice, and its eventual end. So the suspense has been building up. So here it is. The fact that the colonists from Plymouth Colony were able to govern themselves from 1620 until 1686, when the king combined the rest of the New England colonies into a vast new colony called the Dominion of New England, which we'll talk about in further detail a little bit later, demonstrates a good deal of neglect on the part of England in administrating its colonies. It's because of this neglect and other situations that will be discussed a little bit later in more detail, that the period from Jamestown in 1607 until the end of the French Indian War in 1763 will be defined as the period of salutary neglect. So the phrase salutary neglect is justified in describing this period because all of the colonies within a relatively short period of time were able to become virtually independent to some degree. Plymouth and later Massachusetts to the greatest degree, especially Massachusetts. Acknowledging allegiance to whatever authority had control in England, but making their own laws, trading where they pleased, defending themselves without help and without help from home, and working out and developing their own institutions and value systems distinct from England, distinct from anything in Europe, and uniquely what would become later known as American values. The significance of this period is that it allows the American Revolution as an evolutionary process to take place. It wasn't the American Revolution, just wasn't this spontaneous tantrum from the colonists. It is during this time that the colonists in Virginia, Georgia, New Plymouth, and the rest of England's continental colonies were developing their own economic, political, social, and cultural identity. This new identity was a reflection of a new set of values that were developing and new ways of doing things that led to the development of new institutions that were emerging from and within the colonies. And this can be exemplified in three different ways. First, by the colonial practice of annual elections of all officers, governor as well as the colonial legislatures, on a definite date. This practice became popular throughout the colonies and still survives in the federal government with the elections of presidents, senators, and representatives on the same day. Next was in the area of representation. The differences of representation were incredibly significant. In order to vote or hold office in the colonies, a man had to be a landowner or a freeholder in the colony, country, or town where he was running for office. This is known as geographic representation. opposed to what the English believed in, which was virtual representation. Virtual representation is representation of classes and interests rather than of localities. The concept held that since all of the interests of the empire citizens were considered in Parliament, all were therefore virtually represented in that forum. It made little difference that large numbers of Englishmen did not actually elect representatives to Parliament. This was irrelevant because the members of that body represented not the concerns of the individuals or locals, but rather the interests of the nation and the empire as a whole. And this is significant because this is going to be one of the major contentions between the colonists and Great Britain when tensions and conflict arise after 1763 at the end of the French-Indian War. You've all heard no taxation without representation. This is what they're talking about, right? We don't mind paying taxes is basically what that adage is saying, but we just want representation, and we want to be represented from the places that we govern ourselves and have governed ourselves since the founding of each and every one of our colonies. So as American institutions began to diverge from English institutions at an early age, the divergence occurred during the formative stage in colonial development, thereby allowing the colonists to develop their own way of doing things. This had a major impact in the decade after 1763, when the period of salutary neglect ended, and England tried to enforce its institutions, values, and ways of doing things on the colonists. So in many ways, the American Revolution wasn't something, not in many ways, in all ways, wasn't something that the American Revolution wasn't something that the colonists were trying to change. It was something that Great Britain was trying to change. A statement made by John Adams to Thomas Jefferson in 1818, reflecting on the development and growth of the colonies, best describes this process. But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The Revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments, of their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution.